Welcome, everybody. My name is Hayyim Angel. I'm the National Scholar for the Institute for Jewish Ideas and Ideals, and also teach Tanakh at Yeshiva University. And it's amazing that this is already year 19 of the Yemei Iyun of Chovevei Torah. So thank you, as always, to Rabbi Helfgott for inviting me and for organizing it. So my mission is twofold. The easy part is learning all of Sefer Ovadiah with you in about 4 minutes, which is easy. It's a short book. It's 21 verses long, by far the shortest in Tanakh. And then the whole rest of the discussion will be about the Parshanut, the history of interpretation of this very seemingly straightforward book. But boy, oh boy, do our Mefarshim, our commentators, duke it out in a very meaningful way that really helps elucidate how Jews have perceived themselves for the last couple thousand years through the lens of Ovadiah and related Parshanut. So first off, the text. Again, hopefully you have the source sheets. They're in the chat as well, and I will refrain from chatting, which is a rare thing for me for Zoom, but I appreciate the closed caption option that YCT has given. Here goes. So I'm going to read in Hebrew and translate, but you also have the English in front of you if that's easier for you. Chazon Ovadiah says the vision of a prophet named Ovadiah. No further identification about his time, place, not even his father's name, nothing. Okay, so we know nothing about him other than he has a fabulous name. Ko amar Hashem Elokim le'Edom. Shmua shamanu me'et Hashem v'tzir b'goyim shulach kumu v'nakumu aleh ala milchama. Some doom and destruction is going to happen to Edom. So this goes on for a little while. Hinei katon netaticha b'goyim b'zui ata me'od. You are the most degraded, the smallest of the nations. Zedon libecha hishiecha. Your arrogance has misled you. Shochani b'chagvei sela merom shivto omar b'libo mi yorideni aretz. You're so arrogant, you think that nobody can bring you down. You are going down. Okay, so this is a good prophetic discourse on Edom is bad, God hates it, and now it's going down. The time for its destruction is near. Im tagbia kanesher v'im ben kochavim sim kinecha misham oridecha neum Hashem. Even if you're like a griffin vulture, what people traditionally think of as eagle, but it's a nesher, is a biblical nesher, is a griffin vulture. Okay, it still flies high. And even if you think you can go to the stars, Hashem will find you and drag you down. This goes on for several more verses. I dotted it out. Pasuk Yud. Mechamas achicha Yaakov techasecha busha v'nichrata le'olam. Because of the wrong you did to Israel, your brother. So this, of course, ties back to the fact that Edom is the nation that derives from Esav, Yaakov Avinu's twin brother. And so as a result, it's not simply another enemy nation out there, but rather there's a particular venom and animosity that Bnei Yisrael, the people of Israel, feel toward Edom as a consequence of, we're cousins. Hey, what are you doing? What have you done? So far it's been very vague. You all get the gist of it. Edom has done something bad to Israel. Now it's comeuppance time. God is going to smite the living daylights out of Edom. The next few verses from 11 through 14, Yud Aleph through Yud Daled, will be the one glimpse into what Edom did wrong. Okay, so here goes. So that's the second paragraph of source number 1. B'yom amodcha mineged b'yom shavot goyim chelo v'nochrim ba'u she'arav v'al Yerushalayim yadu goral gam ata ke'achad mehem. When the enemy destroyed Yerushalayim, you stood on the side. So it's important to understand, and this is going to come up a bunch today, Edom is not the primary enemy against Yerushalayim in Ovadiah's condemnation. Some other nation has harmed Israel severely, and Edom chose to stand on the sidelines. But wait, not only do they stand on the sidelines, the Edomites, not only did they stand on the side and not help, but they were happy and cheered as the enemy destroyed Yerushalayim. Pasuk Yud Gimel. Al tavo b'shar ami b'yom edam. Al tera gam ata b'ratam b'yom edo. Al tishlachna b'chelo b'yom edo. Not only were they happy and did they cheer, but they also plundered Israel. In other words, they took advantage of Israel's degraded and weakened state as they were getting destroyed to plunder property, whether land or material goods. Not only did they do all that stuff, but they, even as Israelites were fleeing for their lives, the Edomites, not only did they not give them refuge, but they captured them and killed the refugees or turned them over to the enemy. All right, so I don't know who the enemy is or what time period we're dealing with. Maybe I have a hunch, but we're not there yet. But in the meantime, for our purposes now, Edom was not the main enemy, but rather a sidekick enemy. They stood on the sidelines and did not help. They were happy and cheered. They plundered Israel and they captured fugitives and or killed them or turned them back over to the enemy. Those are the specific sins that our cousins, the Edomite people, did at some great day of destruction, Yom Edom, this day of terrible calamity. Okay, Pasuk Tetvav, the third and final paragraph. Kikarov Yom Hashem al kol hagoyim kasher asita yeaseh lach g'mulcha yashuv b'roshecha. You're going down. You're going to be requited for what you have done. Kikasher shetitem al har kodeshi yishtu kol hagoyim tamid v'shatu v'la'u v'hayu k'lo hayu. It's going to be as though you were never there. You're going to be so destroyed. Uvhar Tzion tiyeh pleta haya kodesh v'yarashu beit Yaakov et morashehem. Israel will return, a remnant will come back and inherit you who have plundered them in the past, meaning Edom is going down. The refugees, the remnant of Israel will come back and plunder Edomite property and or land. Beit Yaakov esh, ubeit Yosef lehava, ubeit Esav lekash, v'dalaku bahem v'chalum, lo yesarid lebeit Esav ki Hashem diber. The Edomites are going down and at the hands of Bnei Israel who will return. Israel will be restored and inherit its lands. Pasuk Kaf. And those Israelites who are returning from Tzarefat and Sfarad, they will come to the land of Israel and inherit the lands of the Negev. Israelites will destroy Edom and Hashem will be the king. The end. All right, so we just finished a whole biblical book. You can't always do that in a Yemei Iyun session, and I did it in 8 minutes, a little longer than I had estimated. Okay. Just to recap what the book is about, Edom at some moment in time harmed Israel, specifically when they were being destroyed by somebody else, some other great enemy. They were happy. They did not help. They cheered. They plundered. They turned in fugitives. They killed fugitives. As a consequence of that, they will be punished and they will be destroyed, after which Israel, the remnant of Israel, which has been destroyed by this great destruction, will return, inherit the land of Edom and their property. They will inherit the land of Israel too, and God now will be king. The end. Okay, so I think that's great. We did an excellent job. The end. All right, everything else is Parshanut. Our Mefarshim want to try to narrow this down. They want to say, well, what specifically is Ovadiah referring to? So one track of interpretation, which is not going to go anywhere, is to try to identify the name Ovadiah with some other known character named Ovadiah in Tanakh. That's always a strategy. And in this case, there is one particularly, he's a secondary character, but you got to love him. In fact, you really got to love him. A man named Ovadiah was a chief steward in Achav, the wicked king Achav of the north, in the 9th century BCE. He had his chief steward, his name was Ovadiah, and he was a God-fearing man, says Sefer Melachim. I didn't put it in the source sheets, but I'll tell you where to find it if you want to look it up. It's 1 Melachim 18:3-4. Okay, great. That's where you will find Ovadiah. And he was a God-fearing person who saved prophets and risked his life in order to do so. So there are midrashim, including in the Talmud Bavli, that identify our Ovadiah with that character in Sefer Melachim. Now, could be, Ibn Ezra objects to this on the basic premise that in Sefer Melachim, that person, Ovadiah, is referred to as a God-fearing person, whereas our Navi is a Navi, he's a prophet. So Ibn Ezra thinks, okay, if we're dealing with a prophet, you should identify him there as a prophet also. Abar Ben-El shrugs off that objection very reasonably. Okay, he could have been God-fearing then, and as a result of that, he subsequently attained prophecy, the end, and he received the book that we have in front of us. So this is a dead-end argument, so we're going to cancel it and move on, not in the sense of cancel culture, but in the sense of it's not going to yield any fruits, and therefore we're just going to stop and focus on a possibly more fruitful avenue, which is, can we ascertain anything from the content of what Ovadiah is describing? The few verses that we have, the only ones that matter in this discussion are verses 11 through 14. Psukim Yud Aleph through Yud Daled, where very specific sins of Edom are enumerated. Can we track those sins down to Edom anywhere else in Tanakh? So Ibn Ezra comes up to the plate and says, I'm going to nail this one. And indeed, it sounds like he does. We actually could pick one specific event that matches all of Ovadiah's description, and that is the destruction of the first temple. That was in 586 BCE, where the primary enemy was Babylonia. The Babylonians are the ones who destroyed the temple and Jerusalem. They exiled its inhabitants. But Edom was involved as this evil sidekick nation, exactly as Ovadiah describes. Ibn Ezra cites sources 2, 3, and 4 to prove his point. Source number 2, Al Narop Avel, referring to the time of the Babylonian exile, Sham Yashavnu Gam Bachinu B'Zochrenu Et Zion. The primary gist of the psalm has to do with how the exiles, recently exiled by the Babylonians, are despondent. Here they are in exile. How do we sing God's praises while in the exile? But in that same psalm, which is pretty short, Zechor Hashem livnei Edom et Yom Yerushalayim, Omrim Aru Aru Ad HaYesod Ba. During Yom Yerushalayim, not referring to the 28th day of Iyar, the way that we use that term, but rather the day of Jerusalem's destruction, where the Edomites were standing on the sidelines cheering. Okay, Ovadiah specifically mentions that. So here we have a psalm dated to the time of the destruction, specifically describing the cheerleader aspect of Edom in the context of the Babylonians are the main enemy and the Edomites are cheering on the sidelines, exactly the way Ovadiah describes it. Check. Source number 3, Megillat Eicha, which also is dated to the time of the destruction of the temple, the Book of Lamentations. Sure enough, the primary enemy is the Babylonians, to be sure, but you have at the end of chapter 4 over here in source 3, Sisi v'simchi bat Edom yoshevet be'eretz Utz, gam alayich tavor kos tishkari v'titari. You also will suffer, Edom, for your role in the destruction. Tam avonech bat Zion lo yosif laglotech, pakad avonech bat Edom gila al chatotayich. The author of Lamentations, traditionally Yirmiyahu the prophet, condemns Edom for its role, whatever that role is, during the destruction. So it's clearly not the primary role. The Babylonians were the main enemy. But here is another reference to a secondary role of Edomites during the time of the destruction of the first temple. Finally, we have the most specific reference by the prophet Yechezkel, who is a contemporary of Yirmiyahu, who lived in Babylonia at the time of the destruction of the temple. Here goes. Source 4. Ahi devar Hashem elai lemor ben Adam. Sim panecha al har seir. Prophet, you should turn to the har seir, the land of Edom. Vinave alav. Prophesy against it. V'amarta lo. Ko amar Shem Elokim. Hinni elecha har seir v'natiti yadi alecha v'nataticha shmama mushama. You're going to be destroyed, Edom. Why? Arecha chorba asim v'ata shmama tiyev yadata k'nei Hashem. Then you'll know that I'm God. Yan heyot lechai vat olam. First of all, you've always hated Israel. During the destruction, referring to the Babylonian destruction, you killed refugees, exactly what Ovadiah describes. Likewise, Edom planned on appropriating the land of Israel to themselves as a consequence of the Khurban. All right, so here's our scorecard. Here are 3 texts that are certainly dated to the time of the destruction of the temple by the Babylonians, describing the Edomites as cheering during the destruction, as having some secondary role in the destruction, in killing refugees at the time of the destruction, and on planning on usurping the land of Israel at the time of the destruction. That's everything that Ovadiah described. Okay, so Ibn Ezra says, voila, Ovadiah clearly lived at the time of the destruction of the temple, as condemning Edom for their behavior during the destruction. Now, I have to say, you learn enough Tanakh, you find that it's a rare day that you get a compelling case of this magnitude. Usually, if something isn't obvious, there's going to be a machloket, there will be a debate, and that's healthy. We Jews like to argue, and it's always because something is unclear. This set of arguments is so good, I'm expecting all the later commentators to show up and applaud. Ibn Ezra, you really got this one. Okay, that's what I'm expecting. Okay, get ready for the big letdown for the moment. That doesn't happen. Not only does it not happen, but 3 of our leading luminaries who are post Ibn Ezra, who all read him very carefully, they are Radak, Ramban, and Abarbanel. I'm not supposed to write in the chat, so I will not. But anyway, Radak, Ramban, and Abarbanel blast Ibn Ezra for this interpretation, which sounded so good just a moment ago. They open as many cannons as they can and try to destroy his view because they don't think that he's right. In fact, they have a very strong view that something else completely is going on in Sefer Ovadiah. That's what makes this into a shiur. I thought we were done. With Ibn Ezra, I really felt, okay, we did the text. Ibn Ezra hit it all out of the park in one fell swoop. We're done. Okay, but the shiur part comes up now. The whole rest of the shiur is the courtesy of Radak, Ramban, and Abarbanel going to town, trying to flatten Ibn Ezra's view. And Ibn Ezra's firing back at them, even though he lived before they did. But he was aware of this view prior. So here's how it goes. Radak, Ramban, and Abarbanel, and several other commentators along the way, are convinced that Ovadiah is not talking about biblical Edom at all. Biblical Edom is a geographical nation southeast of the land of Israel, across the Jordan River, where Esav's descendants lived in the biblical period. That's what Ibn Ezra assumes is happening here. Radak, Ramban, and Abarbanel say no. Ovadiah is prophesying the Roman destruction of the Second Temple. Edom does not refer to the biblical nation of Edom at all. It refers to Rome. And Ovadiah is not describing First Temple destruction events. He's anticipating the future second destruction of the temple by the Romans. Okay, so everybody's going to go to war here in the good way. Our Parshanim are going to have it out. They fire heavy artillery cannons at Ibn Ezra by pointing out the following. I'm paraphrasing, but only a little. Biblical Edom was a loser little nation. They were pesky like anything, but they were losers. They were never a major nation. Radak, Ramban, and Abarbanel find it exceedingly hard to believe that an entire biblical book, no matter how small, would be devoted to this tiny loser nation. Rome, on the other hand, they were evil, all right, but they weren't tiny loser. They were big and powerful. So big and powerful, they were able to run an empire and destroy the Second Temple as well as Israel. They were a devastating foe. They warrant a biblical book. And since prophets can see whatever God shows them into the future, okay, so God showed them something deeply into the future. Okay, they also point out, hey, Ovadiah says that Jews from Tzarafat and Sfarad are going to return and destroy Esav. Tzarafat is France and Sfarad is Spain. And Ibn Ezra thinks so too, by the way. Ibn Ezra agrees with those identifications. And the Jews didn't live in France and Spain in the First Temple period. They sure did during the Second Temple period. And in fact, many of these rabbis who are involved in this discussion live in Sfarad or Tzarafat. So to them, this is a pulsating reality. But that's why Radak and Ramban and Abarbanel say, okay, Ovadiah is predicting something that's later than we are. And it's talking about when there's the ingathering of the exiles and Jews return from France and Spain, return to the land of Israel and destroy the offshoots of the Romans. Okay, so that's where they're coming from. And Abarbanel triumphantly points out, Ibn Ezra agrees that since Ovadiah predicts the return of Jews from Tzarafat and Sfarad, that's a reference to Spain and France. So Ibn Ezra agrees that these last several verses cannot refer to biblical Edom because there were no Jewish communities there then. So Abarbanel declares triumph. So to summarize, Radak, Ramban, Abarbanel, and others are convinced that Ovadiah's Edom is not the biblical nation of Edom southeast of the land of Israel, but rather it's the Romans, the Roman Empire, and he's predicting them for the long term. And the prediction of Jews returning from France and Spain corroborates their view. Okay, so that's their view. Now, Ibn Ezra was aware of the fact that there were rabbis even before Radak, Ramban, and Abarbanel who identified Edom with Rome. Ibn Ezra objects very strongly within this prophecy. If you just read here are some of the highlights of Ibn Ezra's rebuttal. First of all, verse 2, back in source number 1, verse 2, you're a small nation. The Roman Empire was not small. It was a very dominant global power. So to refer to Edom as a small nation seems completely out of place. Radak responds to that, though, I think cogently. The point is that Ovadiah is describing them as a degraded nation, not necessarily quantitatively small. So from that perspective, just like the second half of that same pasuk. It says, Bazuya tameod, you're very degraded, you're low. It need not refer to their tininess, it could refer to their lowness. So this argument goes nowhere. Ibn Ezra likewise points out to verse 15 in source 1, pasuk tedvav, ki karov yom Hashem, it's coming soon. Okay, so at the time of the destruction of the first temple, the Edomites were destroyed subsequently by Babylonians, very soon thereafter. That's karov. Radak says, but the Romans are not karov at all. They're many centuries after Ovadiah, regardless of when Ovadiah lived. So Radak responds, karov in prophetic language could refer to it will happen soon, but it also could mean it will happen imminently. Because for a prophet, as long as it's a done deal, you can say karov. As far as a prophet is concerned, this will happen. So this also is not a major objection. But Ibn Ezra's third objection is by far the most powerful objection. And this one is actually a really good one. Ibn Ezra says this prophecy cannot refer to Rome. I'll tell you why. Because Edom in Ovadiah's prophecy is a sidekick nation to a different nation who's doing the destruction. They stood on the sidelines and cheered while somebody else destroyed Yerushalayim. So what's that all about? The Romans, they weren't on the sidelines. They were the lions. They were the ones who destroyed the second temple. They're not the sidekick. So Ibn Ezra says this prophecy absolutely cannot refer to the Romans in some future period just because of that. That's a really excellent objection. In fact, so powerful that poor Radak, even though he's living in the 13th century Provence, he suddenly turns into a 19th century Brisker, just for this one moment, because he's desperate here. Ibn Ezra has a powerful objection. So Radak says, okay, there are two Romes. Those of us who have learned the Brisker Derech in Talmud know exactly where I'm going with this one. There are two Romes. There are the Romans who destroyed the temple, and there were the Romans who stayed back in Rome and cheered while those other Romans destroyed the temple. So you see, some Romans were the destroyers, but other Romans were the sidekicks. Okay, this answer is difficult. It's extremely very hard to swallow, at least for me. When I read that, I'm like, okay, if that's the best you got, you're in trouble, right? So this is where Ibn Ezra is going to have a very good day. But that's just in the realm of a Peshat debate between different commentators. That's what we have over here. This final objection is a devastating one against Radak and Ramban and Abarbanel. But let's take it one step back. Who says that the word Edom in Tanakh ever meant Rome? Right, before we even get to the plausibility of, is Ovadiah referring to Rome? The answer is no, he's not. He's describing a nation that's on the sidelines while some other nation is destroying Jerusalem. This isn't Rome, okay? But even with that, who says that Edom ever means Rome? So that's a really interesting question that belongs totally to the realm of Parshanut. The truth is that the Edomite identification goes back to the rabbinic period. The rabbis of the Mishnah already identified the word Edom with Rome. Some scholars believe that Rabbi Akiva was the very first one to do so. The reason why Rabbi Akiva was definitely involved in wanting to call Rome Edom is because of a prophecy of Bilam. So besides his talking donkey, which makes him very famous alone, he makes some prophetic predictions at the end. After he's been blessing Israel for a while, Balak has fired him. Bilam just goes into this prophetic mode of predicting future events. And look what he says in source 5. Bilam says, okay, I'm going home. You fired me. I'm out of here. Biblically speaking, when it says B'acharit hayamim, that just means at some future point. But in rabbinic language, Acharit hayamim means in the Messianic era. It has taken on a technical term. Rabbi Akiva is going to use Bilam's words that way. Rabbi Akiva said, Bilam is prophesying what will happen in the Messianic era. Part of it is, Erenu v'lo ata, ashirenu v'lo karov. Darach kochav miYaakov, v'kam shevet miYisrael, machatz patei Moav, v'karkar kol b'nei shet. V'aya Edom yiresha. V'aya yiresha se'ir oivav Yisrael osachaya. Here's what Rabbi Akiva filtered out of that. Some kochav is going to come from Israel and destroy Edom. Rabbi Akiva said, okay, the kochav is a man named Shimon ben Kosiba. And Rabbi Akiva is the one who renamed him Bar Kochba. And that's why he named him that, because he's this Kochav. But his real name was Shimon ben Kosiba. We even have coins that he minted, which are very rare, and one's going to go into outer space soon. But in the meantime, that was his real name. But Rabbi Akiva is the one who named him Bar Kochba, because he believed that Bar Kochba is the Mashiach. And he's going to destroy Edom, which is Rome. Okay? So this is where it all seems to come from, or at least it's certainly one of the earliest times that we find in Chazal that Edom is identified with Rome, instead of just the biblical nation southeast of Israel. Okay, so that's Rabbi Akiva's move. And then it really picks up steam in the medieval period, where nearly all of our Mefarshim, including Radak and Ramban and Abarbanel, think that the Romans are actual descendants of Esav. In fact, they take that as historical fact. So to them, when Ovadiah can predict that Edom is going to do some terrible things and therefore get punished, okay, Rome is Edom. Biologically, these are the descendants of Esav. And they're going to harm Israel, and God is going to smite them. That's what Sefer Ovadiah is about. But the thing is, we have to ask, how do our Mefarshim know that Romans are biological descendants of Esav? And the answer here is not rabbinic sources, but rather another book that Mefarshim had in their medieval rabbis had in their library. And it's called Sefer Yosipon. Sefer Yosipon pretended to be the complete works of Flavius Josephus, but it was actually a medieval adaptation of that book written in 10th century Italy by a nice Jew. And it's a fine translation, but that's what most of our Mefarshim had on their shelf. They didn't have the real works of Josephus. They had Sefer Yosipon, which was abridged and changed from the original. And of course, I don't think we need to say this, but I'm going to say it anyway. Even the real works of Flavius Josephus need not be historically accurate all the time. I hope it's okay to say that. We don't have to take it as dogmatically the truth. But he at least lived closer in time to the events being described than the author of Sefer Yosipon. But our Mefarshim didn't realize this chronological gap. Okay, in the introduction to Sefer Yosipon, which is written by its author and is not in the works of Josephus at all, he gives a history of Italy. And this is a very cool history. Here's how he tells the story. None of this is in Josephus. It starts with the passage that is in the Talmud. It's in Masechet Sotah, page 13a, Daf Yud Gimel Amud Aleph. This part is in the Talmud. Now, when Yosef and his brothers brought the bones of Yaakov to bury in Marat HaMachpelah in Hebron, the descendants of Esav, Yishmael, and Keturah tried to block Yaakov's entry. And there was a scuffle and so on. That's the Talmud part. Enter Sefer Yosipon. Yosipon says that in the course of this scuffle, Yosef captured a grandson of Esav, whose name is Tzipho. Tzipho is mentioned in the genealogies in Breshit, chapter 36. We don't know anything about him in the Torah, but he is mentioned there. So in Sefer Yosipon, this guy, Tzipho, was captured by Yosef. But eventually he escaped, and he went off to Carthage. And there, Tzipho got involved in the wars with Italy. And when they won, the natives made Tzipho their king, meaning here you have a grandson of Esav living in Italy now, victorious warrior. He becomes the king of Italy. Tzipho had a grandson, and wouldn't you know it, his name was Latinus. And Latinus is the guy who developed a language that became used by the Romans later on. And then Latinus went on to have more kids and grandchildren and so on and so forth. And a descendant of Latinus is a guy named Romulus, like the Romulus and Remus people. Voila. So in Sefer Yosipon, there is a fiction created over here where the founders of Rome are biological descendants of Esav. That again has no rabbinic antecedent. Okay, so this Romulus, according to Yosipon, I don't even think that this works out according to the Roman mythology about Romulus and Remus, but okay, that's not my problem. In case you didn't notice, I'm not buying it on a historical level, but I'm very interested in how this impacted on our greatest commentators. Romulus, according to this, lived in the time of King David, David Amalek. And David defeated Edom in Tanakh. That's really true. Romulus was so angry at David, he vowed revenge that one day the Romans will come back when they're stronger and defeat Israel. That's all by way of preface to the eventual destruction of the Second Temple. Okay. So Radak, Ramban, and Abarbanel, who accept this as historically true, are sure that the Romans actually are biological descendants of Esav, and that Ovadiah and that Edom is a valid term for Rome. And so, okay, Ovadiah is prophesying the advent of the Roman Empire. Again, even Ezra's objection that Ovadiah is describing a nation that's standing on the sidelines while some other major nation destroys Israel is a devastating blow to this interpretation to begin with. But what matters more is that there's no reason to think that the Romans were biological descendants of Esav. I can't tell you that they were not, or that some of them were not. People can be descended from anybody, but there's no source that makes that, no authoritative source that makes that claim. In all likelihood, Chazal, when they use the term Edom equals Rome, they were not using it in a biological sense at all. They were using it in a conceptual sense, very much like the way that we might use the term Amalek for truly evil people today. Nobody who calls the Nazi Germany or terrorists Amalek would ever, for a second, insist, I hope, that these people must be biologically descended from a man named Amalek, who was also a grandson of Esav. What matters is that it is a conceptual idea. Just as Amalek committed acts of terror by attacking civilians, so too there are people who attack civilians in every age, unfortunately, until Mashiach comes. And these people are the ideological followers of Amalek. So too, Rabbi Akiva and his colleagues, when they referred to Rome as Edom, they were not necessarily referring to them as biological Edom. They likely were referring to them as conceptual Edom. Okay, so that's where we are in the history of Parshanut. Now we can scroll back over to source number one. Keeps coming back to source number one, doesn't it? If you look at Psukim Tet Vav and Tet Zayin in Ovadiah, it's the third paragraph back in source number one, verses 15 and 16. Ki karov yom Hashem al kol hagoyim kasher asita yeaseh lak mulcha yashuv roshecha. What is curious, I didn't belabor the point as we read through quickly before, but let's look at it now. He doesn't only name Edom anymore, even though Edom is the enemy in Sefer Ovadiah. Suddenly it's al kol hagoyim. All of Israel's enemies are dragged into this. And likewise, Pasuk Tet Zayin. Ki kasher shetitem al har kodshi. Yishtu kol hagoyim tamid v'shatu v'layu kelo hayu. Who are these kol hagoyim? It doesn't mean Jews versus non-Jews. It refers to Israel's enemies. So here is Ovadiah talking about a very specific historical nation, Edom, and very specific historical things that they did during the destruction of the first temple. But he extrapolates from them to all evil people of the nations. It could be a metaphor for all of Israel's enemies. This is a very nice jump that Ovadiah is doing, and that presumably Rabbi Akiva used. To Rabbi Akiva, it was a no-brainer. The Romans are acting like Amalek / Edom. They too are harming innocent people, civilians, non-combatants. They're evil, just like Edom Amalek. So just as Ovadiah is expanding the term Edom from a very specific biological, geographical location, southeast of Israel, to wicked nations in general, so too Rabbi Akiva seems to be doing that. And we see ample references to this in other prophets as well. If you jump down to sources 9 and 10, we see two other prophets who do the same thing. This is at the very end of the book of Amos. I'm going to restore the house of David and bring back the people like the good old days. Edom v'chol hagoyim, so that they can inherit Edom and all the nations. Amos, also living centuries before Ovadiah, makes this extrapolation from Edom, a very specific people, to Kol HaGoyim, all of our enemies. Edom seems to be used by the prophets usually as just that nation, but occasionally, like in Ovadiah and Amos, as it also can serve as a metaphor for all evil people. And one other example is source number 10 in Yechezkel. Similarly, Israel's enemies and Edom, they're lumped together in this sense. And Yechezkel seems to be a contemporary of Ovadiah. So Rashi, by the way, plays off of all of this. If you look at the last verse in Ovadiah in source number 1, Kaf Aleph, Ve'alu Mosheim Bahar Tzion Lishparet Har Esav, V'Hayta Lashem HaMelucha. When Edom falls, God will be king. That seems like a big claim if it's just referring to this one little loser nation southeast of Israel. Why should God be king specifically when that nation falls? But if Edom refers as a metaphor to all wicked people on the globe, okay, that's exactly right. When human evil is eradicated, that's when God can be king. So Rashi plays off of that in sources 6, 7, and 8. So we can go back over there. Rashi commenting on this very last verse in Ovadiah. God's kingdom is not complete until Amalek is eliminated. In another nusach of Rashi, by the way, on this pasuk in source 7, similar idea. The idea is that Esav HaRasha / Edom / Amalek represents human evil. And when God defeats human evil, that's when redemption comes. So it sounds like Peshat in Sefer Ovadiah is exactly what Ibn Ezra says, which is one little tweak. Ibn Ezra is right. Ovadiah lives at the time of the destruction of the first temple by the Babylonians. He focuses not on the Babylonian attack, which is other prophets handle, but rather on the secondary but also important role of Edom. The Edomites were our brothers. They were our cousins. Not only did they not help us or sympathize, but they cheered, they were happy. They plundered our land and our property. They turned over refugees and even murdered some refugees. This is Amalek. This is Edom. And that Edom is now extrapolated as a metaphor from this nation to wicked people in general, who are that depraved that they would do these horrible things. And when that type of behavior is destroyed from humanity, that's when God will be king. That's when Malchut Hashem, God's kingdom, will be complete. Rashi says this on the parasha about Amalek in the Torah in source 8. Ki yad al kesia, yadosh al kadosh baruch hu hurmali shava b'kiso, v'yot mo milchama ve'eva b'Amalek olamit. God always will be against Amalek, this human evil. Umahu case, why does it say God's throne in this deficient way? V'lo nemar kisei, why doesn't it just use the normal word kisei? Hashem nechlak lechet yav, why does it say Yah for Hashem's name instead of Yud Kei Vav Kei, instead of God's complete name? Nishba kadosh baruch hu, God swears, she'en shemo shalem ven kiso shalem, ad yimacher shemo shel Amalek kulo. God's name and throne are not complete until Amalek is completely eradicated. And once Amalek is destroyed, then God's throne and name will be complete. Okay, so Rashi understands that V'hayta Lashem HaMelucha, the very last 3 words of Sefer Ovadiah, are playing off of this theme. And I think that Rashi is correct. The idea is that Ovadiah takes a very specific wrongdoing of a specific nation, Edom, and extrapolates that into the broad concept of human evil / terrorism. And when that type of evil impulse is eradicated, that's when God's throne and name finally can be complete. Okay, so that's the gist of Sefer Ovadiah, where Ibn Ezra wins. And the only help that he needed, well, he needed two drops of help. We only helped him with one of them so far. What Rabbi Akiva did by identifying Rome with Edom in the original sense, that it was a conceptual thing, actually seems to be Pshuto Shel Mikra in Sefer Ovadiah, as well as Amos and Yechezkel that we have seen. It's also in Yeshayahu Samach Gimel in source 11, but we don't need to read that. That's just another example of Edom serving as a metaphor for all of Israel's enemies, all of human evil, not just that particular nation. Okay, one last point that Ibn Ezra needs our help for is the point that Abarbanel thought he got him on, which is, well, what about those exiles returning from Tzarefat and Sfarad? If Ovadiah, in fact, is describing the destruction of the first temple and the Edomite secondary reaction and role in the destruction, well, what if France and Spain have to do with that? The answer, of course, is nothing whatsoever, because Tzarefat and Sfarad in Sefer Ovadiah don't mean France and Spain. Even though Ibn Ezra, Radak, Ramban, and Abarbanel all identified Ovadiah's Tzarefat and Sfarad as France and Spain, because that's how they use the terms, but it is extremely unlikely that Ovadiah used those words that way. In the case of Tzarafat, it's actually, we can pin it down. Tzarafat is in today's Lebanon, meaning the Tzarafat that Ovadiah refers to. It's not referring to France. And in fact, Tzarafat appears in Tanakh, specifically in the Eliyahu narrative, that Eliyahu had to go very, very north to flee Achav and Izebel, and possibly for other purposes as well. And that's in source 12 over here. Kum lech Tzarafata asher Sidon. Sidon is north of Tzor, which is Tyre. So this is Phoenicia / Lebanon. That's where Tzarafat, biblical Tzarafat is. It's not France at all. You know, the history of how France eventually got the Hebrew name Tzarafat, I don't know, but I'm sure there are people who do know. All I can tell you is that Ovadiah is not talking about France. He is talking about Lebanon, which was very much close to the land of Israel. It was a neighboring nation. And presumably Jews were there at the time of the destruction and shortly thereafter, because that was a nearby place to go. Okay, so that's that. Tzarafat is easy. When it comes to Sfarad, as this is the only place in all of Tanakh where the word Sfarad appears. And in fact, many Sephardic Jews very proudly said, you see, our community goes back to the biblical period, and our proof is that Ovadiah mentions us. But there's something very circular about this. If you go through the Talmud, which is way after Ovadiah, how do they always refer to Spain? And the answer, of course, is Aspamia, like Espana. They don't call it Sfarad in the Talmud. They call it by the Spanish name, Espana. And the reason why they don't call it Sfarad is because Sfarad wasn't the name for Spain. Espana, they simply used the word that Spain would have used for itself. Sfarad in Sefer Ovadiah presumably is somewhere else. It's not a reference to Spain at all, but rather it's some other location. Now here scholars have disagreements about what place is most likely. My personal favorite at the moment is Sardis in Asia Minor, which in Aramaic is spelled Samech Pei Reish Dalet, which of course is the same spelling as Sfarad. Okay, so that's my favorite. That's my favorite. But okay, if one of the other theories that's out there is correct, that's fine with me too. All I can tell you is Ovadiah is not saying that Jews from Spain and France are going to return to the land of Israel after the Roman exile. He is saying that after the Babylonian exile, many centuries beforehand, Jews will return from Lebanon and I guess Sardis, that seems to be the most likely thing in Asia Minor, where Jewish communities are ancient. We're not dealing anymore with the more medieval communities of Spain and France, but rather with communities that were very active already in the biblical and certainly the post-biblical period. Okay, so just to bring it all home, and then we'll have a little time for Q&A. Ibn Ezra basically is right. Ovadiah lived at the time of the destruction of the first temple, and Ovadiah excoriates the Edomites, the nation southeast of Israel, for playing a secondary but wicked role during the destruction by cheering, by stealing land and property from Israel, and by murdering refugees and or turning them into the Babylonians as prisoners. They are therefore going to get their comeuppance by Jews who will return from the first exile, from this Babylonian exile, as far remote as Lebanon and Turkey, to use our language, rather than Spain and France. When Edom falls, and when the metaphor for Edom, namely human evil, is eradicated, like what we call Amalek, that's when God's kingdom finally will be complete. So Ibn Ezra needed two tweaks. One was just understanding that Edom is more than just the nation of Edom in Sefer Ovadiah, but rather it becomes a metaphor for all human evil, which other prophets did as well. And the other one is just understanding that Sfarad and Tzarafat in Sefer Ovadiah are not France and Spain, but rather they are two nations that already had Jews living in them in the biblical period. So Ovadiah was referring to his time period rather than prophesying some very, very distant thing. And that leaves us just with the prayer. Again, you could slant however you want politically. I'm completely non-political. I'm just interested in human morality. That's where Tanakh takes us. That we should just pray that may Amalek, whoever you think is Amalek, may human Amalek really fall. May God protect all good people of conscience, and may the redemption that Ovadiah longs for, may it finally speedily be realized in our day. So I'm done with my shiur and on the spiel side of things, and we now have a few minutes for Q&A. I don't know if Shabbos, you're going to moderate that, I'm just supposed to be out there on my own and take it as you will. But if you want to call on people, that would be great.
Right, I'll help a little. So thank you so much. If you have a question, I think the easiest way is you can virtually raise your hand. If on the bottom of your screen you'll see a button called reactions. You click reactions, there'll be an option to say raise your hand. If you do that, I can unmute you. That's probably the easiest way. Or feel free to use the chat function.
You always need that icebreaker, and then it just opens up. You know how it goes.
Someone has to be the Nachshon. So again, if you click reactions on the bottom of your screen, it'll say raise hand.
There we go. Okay, thank you. Perspective is different than what I expected. Okay, fair enough. I don't know what you were expecting, but I hope it's good that we came up with another thing. Edom Mizrach are referred to as Sfarad. Look, I'm aware of the fact that Sfaradim, Jews who derive from Spain, are called Sfaradim. By the medieval period, the Jews of Spain referred to themselves as Sfarad. There's a very interesting theory that I read, the theory itself is over 60 years old, that there were trade routes, Mediterranean trade routes, which left from Sardis and other ports that went toward what we call Spain. And so it very well might be that Jews who were very much involved in this trade took that name with them when they showed up in Spain originally and named their country in Hebrew Sfarad. And so that seems to be where that comes from, that they actually derived the Hebrew name Sfarad for Spain instead of Aspamia, as the Talmud uses it, deriving from these trade routes. I thought that made a lot of sense. That's just Ashken normativity who use Sephardi to mean anyone who's not Ashkenazi. I was going to point that out as well. Thank you, David. It's good to see you, by the way. Hoping all is well on your end. Yes, the Sephardim refer really in a technical sense to those Jews who left Spain or the Iberian Peninsula. You can count Portugal in that also, and either formed or joined other existing communities outside of there at the time of the expulsion, or the pogroms that led up to the expulsion. Jews who of Yemen, or just Jews who lived in North Africa, the Middle East, etc., who never went through Spain, are not, or Italians and Ethiopians are not Sephardim. The best term to describe this broader community, I don't like Edot HaMizrach either, for this very simple reason that Morocco is way more west than Poland, right? So I don't know where this west-east thing came from. So I think a better way of calling it is the term pan-Sephardim, which Dr. Henry Toledano, Zichrono Livracha, coined it just because of this problem. To call it Eastern doesn't make any sense. To call it Sephardim definitely doesn't make sense because of what David just said. That's correct. So pan-Sephardim just means, okay, Sephardim and all the communities that they joined when they left, and then others who really don't fit that bill at all, like Yemen or Ethiopia, where plus those Jews, Sephardim did not take over those communities at all. If so, wouldn't have been New Sfarad. I don't understand. Michael, would you care to clarify? Oh, Sancheriv mixed up everybody, but there still was a nation of Edom at the time of the destruction. Right? I mean, Sancheriv definitely deported and repopulated. It's not just Sancheriv, the Assyrian Empire in general completely devastated the whole ancient Near East and also practiced repopulation. All the same, the nation of Edom retained some integrity, as did the other nations, by the way. What matters for the Sancheriv thing that you are invoking is that we can't use those terms ethnically by the post-Assyrian. So as the Torah, the Torah prohibits intermarriage to certain ethnicities, even if they so-called convert, even if they join our people in other ways. After the Assyrians, you no longer can say that somebody living in Ammon or Moab or Edom truly is an ethnic Ammonite or Moabite or Edomite because of these repopulations. But Edom still functioned as a nation post the Assyrian Empire. They were very much there. Just read the prophets, like what we just read right now. Ovadiah still describes the nation of Edom in the Babylonian period. Okay, Michael Schatz.
Yeah, if Sfaradim really took that name because they came from biblical Sfarad. You would have thought, just like the Europeans did when they came to America, it would be New Sfarad, or Sfarad HaChadashah, not just Stam Sfarad, which they knew perfectly well where it was.
Oh, you're absolutely right. But I can also see, since they brought this with them, that's how that they're allowed to do it. You're right. You might expect that they would choose New Sfarad the way that we use that term today, but it could be that they simply brought with them that term because it was part of the same trade route. That theory may be wrong, and I'm all fine with your objection. I don't need to defend it. I just put something out there to give some sense of where the Jews may have taken on that name, but perhaps some other reason, there's a better reason, which I don't know about. What about Rabbi Sonnenfeld, who claimed that Germany were the Amalekites around 1884? What do you mean, what about it? Exactly. Germany were, I don't know why specific in 1884. I guess they were evil enough in Rabbi Sonnenfeld's view to call them that. But we can use the term Amalek in reference to truly evil people without having to make any biological claim that these people descend from Amalek. So if Rabbi Sonnenfeld is making a biological claim, I can't tell you that he is wrong, but I don't know how he could possibly know, right? In other words, what I'm interested in is just the conceptual way that we've used the term Amalek. And all I'm saying is that in the biblical / rabbinic period, we didn't use Amalek. We used the word Edom for that purpose. I'll close out with one Gemara mentions Germany. Yeah, Germany is in several Gemarot. I'll close out with one just interesting, anomaly in our liturgy. Ovadiah is read by many communities as the Haftarah of Vayishlach. Now, it's kind of ironic because in Parashat Vayishlach, the whole thing is that Yaakov and Esav hug and kiss. They reconcile after years of enmity and estrangement. Whereas the whole point of Ovadiah is the eternal enmity between Yaakov and Esav, right? It's kind of a downer that we draw off a theme which clearly is the biblical reality. Israel and Edom very often warred with each other throughout the entire biblical period, right? But it's interesting that it was chosen by many communities as the Haftarah, given that in the parasha it's the exact opposite. That's that one moment where I don't know what Esav is planning on doing with Yaakov, but then when they embrace and they're buddies and loving brothers, it's a very moving scene. And so it's kind of sad that historical reality turned in a different way, which is Israel and Edom continued to be enemy nations throughout, even after that nice reconciliation in the Torah. So Ovadiah, in fact, reflects the later biblical reality, but still it's a jarring haftarah in light of what the parasha does. On that incredibly happy note, I want to thank YCT once again for having me. It's been a pleasure participating in all 19 Yemei Iyun up until now. We all hope and pray, of course, not only for a Shana Tova, but also just for good health in our community and globally for all that's been going on. And please God, soon in our day, we'll be able to once again get together somewhere and learn in person in a way that will be helpful and wonderful all around. On that happy note, Shana Tova, and thank you again. And I turn it back over to Shabbos for the goodbye.